Coming off of a series about anxiety, I wanted to bridge between the two with a question. When did you realize that your life wasn't going like you thought it would? There's some interesting chuckles there. So we're going to be in the book of Esther, and we're going to start with chapter 1. But that question is the beginning there, and it's really going to kind of be an overarching theme of the whole thing. When did you realize that your life wasn't turning out like you planned? Maybe you never thought you'd be in this stage of your life without your spouse, that they were gone too soon. Something happened and tragic, and you don't have your spouse with you anymore. Or you never saw yourself in the financial situation that you're currently in. Maybe you never expected to be divorced, and what you're experiencing now is traced back to that. Or maybe you could never imagine the physical strain that it would be just to get out of bed every day. If that's you, then this next 4 weeks is for you. Even if your life is exactly as you planned it, even if it's precisely how you laid it out, then this is for you too. On the front end, I want to give you some homework. I want you to read the book of Esther. It's only 10 chapters. It won't take you very long. We're going to go through the entire month of February looking through the book of Esther. So I want you to take a look into the book of Esther and just read it. It flows well. It's written as a narrative, so it flows really well. But I'll give you a little spoiler alert here at the beginning. You'll notice that when you read it, God's name is nowhere in the text. Esther is one of 2 books in the Bible that do not mention God. And the Bible is God's story. The Bible is the way that God has communicated through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit to man to write down His word. It was compiled through various scrolls and letters, and was put together and made into what we know now as a Bible. And if it's the story that God has told us and it's His word, why would there be any portion of it that doesn't speak about Him? Not one time is God's name mentioned. And from the very beginning, from the very first chapter of the first book of the Bible, we hear God speak. Throughout the Old Testament, we hear about Him walking with thunderous footsteps. He sent the 10 plagues in Exodus. He spoke, and the mountains shook. He parted the Red Sea. He parted the Jordan River at least 3 different times. On Mount Carmel, when Elijah was up there, he came down with fire. He showed Himself strong. In the book of Daniel, He appeared. His hand was writing on the wall, proclaiming judgment. He has shown Himself strong throughout the entire Old Testament. And when you come to Esther, nothing. You don't see what's happening. There is no specific, God said this. He's silent in this book. And there are those who know what that feels like. You have prayed and prayed, and you haven't gotten an answer yet. You have prayed, God, I don't know why this keeps happening. I don't know why I cannot make it out of this. It seems like every time I take a step up, I get knocked back down. Why is it that all of this is continuing, God? I don't know where you are. I cannot see you. And there's some, maybe you know that He's there. Your faith isn't shaken. You know that He's there. You just can't see Him like you once did. Or you don't feel His presence like you used to. Well, He hasn't left. But what this is called quiet providence. Quiet providence is when God is working behind the scenes, and He's still orchestrating every scene to see His perfect plan into action. And to see it to its perfection. And that's what's happening in Esther. God is behind the scenes. We don't see His name. We don't hear His voice. But we do find evidence of His presence. And I love that. In fact, we're going to take a step outside of Esther for a moment. And this is something that I feel is remarkably relevant for not only today, but just us in general. Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9. My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Well, that really actually inspires me and says, I have to say, thank you, God, that my ways are not his ways, and that his ways are higher than my ways. Know this. You may not be able to trace God, but you can always trust him. We sang that earlier. We trust you. You may not be able to see exactly what's going on, but you can always trust that he's doing. He will never leave you. Now, I've been an athletic person for the majority of my life, and when I was out of high school and out of college and went back to my hometown, I began coaching the team that I played on when I was in school. And I've coached different sports. I've coached football. I've coached baseball and softball. But there's different tactics that people use when coaching. And you know, sometimes coaches have to raise their voice in order to be heard. It happens. You know, I remember my coaches raising their voice at me, really yelling at me, "Cannon, get over here! No, Cannon, don't do that!" And sometimes when I want to correct a mistake, I'll see something, and I would use a voice that was even louder than my normal coaching voice. I would use my outside voice, and then I would use my coaching voice, which went above and beyond that. And it's not always an angry thing. It's just a projection thing. It's always, I want to get their attention. But there's other times when I wanted the opposite. Being loud was motivating, but what I really wanted, when I really wanted to get that player's attention, I would pull them close and I would whisper. I would pull them close and say something that was just for them. And it wasn't always to make a correction. It wasn't always that they were doing something wrong and I pulled them in because I didn't want anybody else to hear how bad I was, ripping them. No. It could have been just to encourage that player and let him know that I was there. Because there's certain intimacy in a whisper. There's a certain connection that you have. I didn't whisper to every player, only the players that I thought needed it in the moment. And through this series, we're going to see God working in ways like that, where he brings people close, where he's doing things that others can't see and they don't know. He's not thundering from the mountain. If you've been reading the Bible through with us in our annual reading program, and we're in the book of Exodus, and we just got through where God was giving the 10 Commandments, and the children of Israel were at the base of the mountain, and they looked up and they saw the cloud, and they saw God was up there seated on his throne, and when he spoke, everybody fell to the... That's not what's happening in Esther. He's not leading with a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day. He's not raising the dead, but God is leading. And in these moments of life, he's not shouting to do it. That means you're going to have to listen. That means you're going to have to pay attention. You're going to have to be quiet, and you're going to have to be close to him so that you can know what he's doing and what he's saying. So that when God tells you something, the correct answer is always yes. Don't ask questions like why or how. When God speaks, say yes and trust that he will provide the rest. God may send you somewhere, and you're like, well, I don't know about that. God may inspire you to do a specific ministry or be involved in a certain thing. Well, but I can't do that. I'm not sure. Just say yes and trust that he's going to provide the rest. You may not be sure what the next season of your life will look like. Say yes and trust that God will provide the rest. I'm going to take a short detour, and we're going to loop back into Esther. But I felt like we needed this today. Transparency. You get what you see is what you get up here. I was difficult to have the moment with sending out the Browns. But God, the other day I was struggling with this, and God brought me to this place. And, I was having one of those, oh, God, no, please, no, not that, God. But God brought me back to a place last year when Pastor Roy, our former associate pastor, went to Lakeland to become a senior pastor there. He brought me to that moment. And then there were a couple other scenarios, and God spoke to me about all of those. And he spoke something to me that immediately calmed my heart and my mind. And I made mention of it earlier, a season of sending. None of this is being done with bitterness or anger. These families have given. They've given their time, they've given their talent, they've given their treasure to Ridge Community Church, and we have poured into them, they have poured into us, and they're taking a part of Ridge Community Church with them wherever they go. Each of these, not exclusively talking about the situation today, all of these that have transitioned over the past few months are taking Ridge Community Church with them wherever they go. And it was then that I became convicted about how I was feeling. It was like, ooh. I was thinking about how hard things would be here. Oh, no. I was thinking about how much I miss Roy and Lauren and their kids. God, who's going to do this? And how are we going to do that? And what's going to happen? And God convicted me in that moment. And he said, shh, listen. Stop having your own little pity party and listen to what I'm saying and watch what I'm doing. Why do you want to hoard all that gift and talent for yourself? Oh, and I felt real bad at that moment. But I want all the good. I want this who can do that, and I want this person who can do that, and I want to... And he's like, why are you storing that up when I am sending it out? And he reminded me of my calling to raise people up, to raise up leaders and send them. And he spoke that word to me of a season of sending, and I was calmed. It was like Moses and God at the burning bush. Moses said, God, I can't do this. And God's like, I'm sending your brother Aaron. It took almost a week to travel from Egypt to where Moses was on the mountain that day. And by the time, in fact, he said, God told him, look, Aaron is coming to meet you. So God had sent Aaron days before this conversation with Moses. God knew what he needed, and he sent the answer before Moses ever even heard the call. Moses just had to say yes and trust God with the rest. As painful as it is, we are in a season of sending. So when God whispers, when God gives direction, the correct answer is always yes, especially when you don't know what lies ahead. God may give you direction that's completely away from what you've ever known or done. God, I can't do that. I'm not equipped for that ministry. I don't like that particular ministry. Maybe it's working with kids. God, I don't even like kids. If God sends you, just say yes and trust that he will provide the rest. In fact, he says, when he speaks it, if you say, well, I don't know, God, he'll speak. If you listen real close, he'll say, you know what? I've already sent your help. It's already on the way. Head towards where I'm sending you, and he'll meet you on the way. God's leading people into places where you've never walked. So, will you join me today in trusting God? I want us to say it. If you will join me today in trusting God, just say yes. Yes. That was a great yes. That wasn't one of those where I have to do a preacherism. Like, oh, y'all ain't shouting like as good as I'm preaching. Do it again. No, y'all said yes on the first try because you were saying yes to God. That's good. Now, back to Esther. I'm going to give you some setup. This is kind of what's going on. And I was telling somebody earlier, they're like, you're going to hear about Esther today? I'm like, well, kind of. What? Well, Esther doesn't show up until the second chapter, so we got a whole lot to go before we even get to the character of Esther. But this is the book with her name, so we're going to begin there. The setting of this story is approximately 480 BC. 480 years before Jesus, in the Persian capital city of Susa. The Persian king was a man named Xerxes, and he was the grandson of Cyrus the Great. Some of you may know from history who Cyrus the Great was. Some of you may recognize Xerxes if you've seen read certain things, or you've seen the movie 300. It's fiction. But these were real people. We'll talk more about Cyrus the Great in just a few minutes. But at this moment in history, Xerxes is the king. And Esther opens with Xerxes throwing a party. And this is no ordinary party. This is a ridiculous party. He invited all the governors, all the nobles, and he even had the army there. They partied, and while he was partying, he was showing off the treasury. He was showing off the wealth and power of the Persian Empire. Esther 1:4, Xerxes showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days. 180 days. 180-day party. That's 6 months. He was so impressive that he showed his glory and his might and his power for 6 months, partying with all the government officials and with the army in the capital city of Susa. You see, the Persian army were known for being conquerors. People didn't stand against the Persian army. They would take them over. So when Xerxes was showing off his wealth, he was showing the wealth that they had taken from all of these other nations that they had conquered. It wasn't their own wealth. It was a reflection of their power. He was flexing. He was saying, I'm Xerxes. You want to know how bad I am? I'm going to throw a 6-month party, and I'm going to spend billions of dollars just to show you how awesome I am. He was flexing on how many other nations they had defeated, including the Babylonians, which were the nation that was the ones who conquered the Israelites. There was something significant about this 6-month party. There was a reason he was flexing like this. He had the political leaders, he had the nobles, he had the army. All of them were there because he was buttering them up for the next big campaign militarily. They were celebrating all that they had conquered, but there was still one up-and-coming nation that they had not yet approached, and that was Greece. The Greeks were coming. The Greeks had all these city-states, and they were beginning to rally together. They were taking over the world in their own right, and Xerxes wanted to challenge the Greeks so he could be king of kings. And through history, we know that was actually the beginning of the end of the Persian Empire. He should not have gone against the Greeks because they ended up defeating him. But the Greeks, the Babylonians ruled, and then the Medes and the Persians defeated the Babylonians, and that's where this takes place. The Persians were defeated by the Greeks, and then Alexander the Great, the rise of Alexander the Great, and then at the end of that, the Romans took over, and the Roman Empire is what's in charge at the time of Jesus. So there's just a quick history timeline from the book of Esther all the way to the time of Jesus. Back to the story. After 6 months of partying, Xerxes decides this isn't enough time. I'm going to extend the celebration a little bit more. 180 days they've been throwing a party, and then if that party wasn't big enough, Xerxes says, I'm going to go one step further. Verse 5, and when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. 180 days, not enough? 1 more week. But this one was even more indulgent than the 6-month-long party. Verse 6, there were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars. And also couches of gold and silver on mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion, for the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. They're drinking out of these golden goblets. Much of them were spoils of war that they had taken, and they're just taking the treasure that was decorative, and they were using it, and they were just lavishing themselves. And they were told, get as drunk as you want, no judgment, get as drunk as you want. And that was this 7-day feast. Man, the Persians had some things going on. The king had a queen. Queen's name's Vashti. And while Xerxes was having his party, she was throwing her own party. Verse 9 says, Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to the king. So women in that time were not allowed, they were not permitted to dine with the men or to attend parties with the men, because women were viewed as property. And so the queen was more of a figurehead. And so she had, if she wanted her own influence or her own thing, she had to do that on her own, and that's what was happening. This was the end of the second week. She's throwing her own party. He's, 6 months of throwing his wealth around and impressing government officials, and now he's on the last day, and he wants to show off his trophy wife. And so he summons her. Have her put her crown on. I want her to walk the catwalk. But that didn't go over too well. Verse 12, Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. Xerxes, the king, he did what other people have done throughout history. It's usually not the best thing to do when you have a fight with your wife. But she refused him, and so he called his buddies and complained to them. He went to his advisors, and he asked, what should he do about her just denying his edict? And the advisors were concerned that the queen disobeyed the king, but you'll see in the text that it wasn't just their relationship that they were concerned about. It was the ripple effect. We have to do something about this, because if she'll do that to the king, our wives will certainly do that to us. Verse 16, then Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Xerxes. Not only did she insult you, but she insulted your entire empire. And people who are in those little bitty countries tucked away, days and days and weeks ride away from us, they'll eventually find out about it. And you know what? She insulted all the men in that little region too. In the furthest corners of your empire, everybody's going to see how she insulted you. And if a king is somebody who throws a 180-day party, he's kind of vain. And so any challenge to his vanity is going to cause some trouble here. Verse 17, for the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt. Since they will say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she didn't come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. These women are going to rebel against their husbands. You're going to lose your entire nation. You're going to lose your empire. Not only does it sting that your wife embarrassed you in front of all of your staff and all of these important people that you're trying to impress, but she has sinned against the entire nation, and you're going to lose your entire authority. Verse 19, if it please the king, I love that. So, but if it please the king, let a royal order go out from him. And let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Xerxes, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So they wanted to send a message. They had to do something extreme here. And the king issued a decree, and it wasn't just an announcement. It wasn't just, she is no longer allowed in the king's presence, and that makes its way to the corners of the empire. That would have been, okay, yeah, I get that. The rest of the women in the Persian Empire hadn't disrespected their husbands or the king in any way, but there needed to be a message sent. So verse 20, when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. These women didn't do anything wrong, but because the queen did, now every woman is going, there's a law passed that they're going to have to go above and beyond to show honor to their husbands. Verse 21, this advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. 22, he sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, that every man be master of his own household and speak according to the language of his people. Send these letters out. In fact, when you go to the land of the Hebrews, have it in Hebrew. When you go to the Arabian desert, have it in Aramaic. All of these, whatever it may have been that they spoke in those, make sure that everyone in my empire knows and that it's read and that everyone. So what that did was that really kind of was another show of power. But that caused something else to happen. This whole event, Vashti rejecting the king because he wanted her to come and put her crown on and do a little twirl in front of his buddies. Her refusal to do that and this law, the subsequent edict that went out, created a need. There was no queen. And the king had to have a queen. Their culture maintained that the king must have a queen. So, shh. Can you hear it? God was working behind the scenes. They couldn't have known Esther, who at this point, at this moment, was just a beautiful young woman who had not revealed herself as being a Jew. She was just a beautiful young woman living in Susa, living in the region, and all of this was happening, and she was going to be ordained to become the next queen to save her people. All of that was down the road, but she had no idea. Nobody had any idea. God was working behind the scenes. Everything was being laid out perfectly for his amazing plan and will to take place. God isn't mentioned at all in that chapter. But we're beginning to see how he's laying the groundwork to choose his specific chosen woman to lead in this area, to rescue his chosen people. She is going to become the queen of the Persian Empire. And that would lead to saving the Jews from extinction. Take comfort to know God is whispering, I'm at work in your situation. Come here, get close, get close, get close, get close. Arm around you, real close, right in your ear. I've got this. I can't tell you right now. You're not ready for it. But I've got this. When you listen for it, you may not see him, you may not feel him, you may even doubt that he knows your name, but you trust him. You say yes, and you trust that he will provide what you need. Be assured he is working his plan. Looking back in Genesis again, Genesis chapter 12 and verse 3, God is speaking to Abraham, and he's setting up covenant with Abraham, the father of the Hebrew people. And he says, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. All the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. This covenant that God has made with Abraham is that he would make him into a great nation and that he would establish greatness through the Jewish people. That God would use this family, this man who didn't have his first child until he was an old man. And that wasn't even the one he was supposed to. The second child that was the chosen one would be the one that he had as a very old man, and his wife was a very old woman. That was the line that he would make into a great nation. How is God going to make his descendants as the stars of the sky and the grains of sand in the sea when he doesn't even have a son? And to trust God, say yes, and he will trust, and then trust him to take care of everything else after. But that's what would happen. God would use this family to grow his people into a great nation. And out of that family, through one of Abraham's grandsons, Judah, the line of Judah, would come the Son of God. Would come Jesus, the Messiah, to save the world. And through Jesus, he offered himself as a sacrifice to pay for the sins of humanity. And those who believe, who call on the name of the Lord, will be saved. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. And if you have made that decision and you are a follower of Jesus, then you are adopted into that covenant. You are a joint heir. We together have the inheritance of eternity, and that makes us new Jews. God told Abraham that through his descendants he would bless all the people on the earth. That didn't have an expiration date. And that means that as new Jews, God blesses the world through us. Through his son Jesus, we are adopted in, and God blesses the world through us. But looking back in Genesis, God makes that promise. And okay, so this is an amazing promise. God blesses Abraham. Isaac is blessed. Jacob is blessed. All of this takes place, so then there should just be this lineage of this amazing faith, and nobody ever wavered, right? Nobody ever, up here, guys, up here, it happens. Nobody ever wavered, right? No, that's not right. Things begin to happen. The Israelites, they became a great nation, but they wanted a king like other people, other nations around them, so God gave them a king, and that king failed. So God gave him another king and another king. And time again, the kings failed. And what ended up happening? The kingdom, the 12 tribes of Israel that were united as a kingdom, they split. And there were two kingdoms. And you can see throughout the Old Testament, through Kings and Chronicles, at the end of the king's reign, more often than not, there were some righteous kings, but more often than not, whenever a king would die and the next one would take over, it would say, this man did more sin than his father before him. And they were constantly leading both the kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. These kings were constantly leading the people of God into idolatry, away from God, into paganism. And this was happening over and over and over, and it was getting worse and worse, further and further from God. Eventually, God had enough, and he allowed both kingdoms to be defeated and led into exile. The Babylonians came in. They sacked Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple. They took the best people. They destroyed the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, and it has never existed in the same way again, even to today. Israel is a nation now, but it is not a kingdom in the way that it was back then. The Israelites were in exile in the Babylonian Empire. Throughout that, I mentioned earlier with the where God showed up in the book of Daniel with the handwriting on the wall. That was an exchange of power. The Babylonian Empire was falling, and the Medes and the Persians rose up and took over. And that's where we find ourselves. Xerxes' grandfather, Cyrus the Great, that I mentioned earlier. Cyrus the Great is the one that allowed the Jews to return home. It was an amazing thing. There was 70 years of exile. He allowed them to return back to their home. However, that was under the rule of the Persian Empire. Follow with me. I'm bringing it in for a landing. The Persians ruled the entire area, so the Jews could go home, but they were still under Persia's rule. That's going to be important in a couple of weeks, so remember that. Many of the Jews went back to their homeland, but not all of them. Some of them stayed, and that leads to where we are in Esther. Why didn't they go home when they had the chance? Why are there even still Jews in Susa? Why are there Jews that are living anywhere near the central area of the Persian Empire? Because life for them was comfortable and it was easy. It's all they knew. It had been 120 years from the time of Esther to the time of the initial exile, or till Judah was overtaken. From the time that the Babylonians came and took them away and destroyed the temple until the time of Esther had been 120 years. So Esther and Mordecai, they're characters that come later in the story, they never knew what Israel looked like. They were born in exile. And so, sure, some of them were allowed to go home. Actually, they were all permitted to go home, but some of them stayed. They were like, we don't want to. It had been decades since the earliest Jews were taken, and now 2 generations had lived in this foreign land and become comfortable, and they didn't know the promised land. They settled for what was familiar. By time 50 years after they were allowed to go home, 50 years later is where we have Esther and Mordecai's story, and they settled for what was familiar, and that is a trap of the enemy. Settling for what you know and what's comfortable is a trap of the enemy. He'll tell you that you don't need to listen to that whisper. Look, everything is the way it needs to be right now. If God's speaking to you about something, that ain't God. No, because if you do that, it'll upset your comfort. We need some people to have leadership roles in certain areas of ministry in the church, and the devil will say, "No, that's not for you. No, you can't lead Community Kitchen because that'll mean that you have something every second Sunday, and that you just can't make that kind of commitment." And that's the devil when God is whispering and he is inspiring you to do something. It's a trap of the enemy. Just sit there. Someone else will do it. And he'll deceive you into thinking that comfort is God's will. No, if you do that, it'll cause a conflict. And you don't want conflict. God doesn't want conflict. He wants you happy and comfortable. Yeah, I like that. God wants me comfortable and happy. Where is that in the Bible? Oh, yeah, it's not. God just wants me to be happy. God wants you to be blessed. God wants you to be in His will. But that's deception. Mordecai and Esther, still in Susa. The Jews had been allowed to return 50 years prior to this. And if you asked them why they were still there, I imagine it could be something like, well, things are comfortable here. Why would I go to this land that I never known? I have a home here. If I go back to where my ancestors are from, there's no house there. Everything was destroyed. I have to start over from scratch. I don't want to start over from scratch. This is the only life I ever know. Little did they know that God was working behind the scenes. And that's where I'm going to leave the story for now. Next week, we're going to actually be introduced to Esther. We're going to see a little bit more. But now what? Now, we go and change the world. Now we do what we're called to do. And it's my responsibility to equip you to do so. It's not my responsibility to do all of the things. It's my responsibility to equip people to do the things. If I were to do all of the things, I wouldn't have time to do anything. I wouldn't have time to spend with my family. God did not call me to ministry over my family. If I choose ministry over my wife and my children, my priorities are out of order. I'm going to end this a little bit differently. The team is coming. They're going to sing that, "We Trust You." They're going to sing that, "Your ways are higher than our own." And I want you, in fact, let's go ahead. Let's everybody stand because I want us to sing that together. That's how I want to conclude the service today. But I want this challenge that I have already issued, I want this to be the echo of the last thing that you hear from me today. When God speaks, say yes. Even if it seems like an obstacle. God's not leading me into an obstacle. I can't go that way. That path isn't clear. God will make a way. Say yes and trust that God will be there when you get there, that God will give you what you need along the path. If God speaks, it may seem like an obstacle. It may seem like the wrong path, but that's how the enemy works, because he can see what you can't see. He can see God making a way for you. He can't see inside your heart, but he can lay things in your mind, and he can distract you with things and try to get you away from where God is stirring you. And if that's it, then the battle's already won there. So we don't have that. No, we step back and we say, you are defeated. It doesn't matter how hard the road looks. I say yes, and God will help me along the way, because God works behind the scenes. It's not about you and what you can and can't do. It's about your obedience and the Spirit of God equipping you along the way. Father, I thank you